Hi, everyone, and welcome to NYFA photo events. Just a reminder that there'll be Q&A after, so please stay with us and put your questions in the chat, or I'm sorry, questions and answers. Welcome, everybody. I'm very proud to introduce Pauline Vermare this morning. Pauline Vermare's career began as the head of the productions and communications team at Cartier-Bresson Foundation from its founding in 2002. For the next 7 years, she collaborated with the director on the production of over 15 exhibitions in their catalogs, including those of Bill Brandt, Walker Evans, Cartier-Bresson, Bruce Davidson, Helen Levitt, and Saul Leiter. At MoMA, she assisted curator Peter Galassi for the exhibition and publication Henri Cartier-Bresson, The Modern Century. Pauline was an assistant curator at ICP, where she preserved and curated Kappa Archive and co-curated many exhibitions, including Kappa in Color, Elliot Erwitt Personal Best, Sebastian Salgado Genesis, and Magnum Manifesto with Clément Choroux and Clara Beauvrais. She also co-curated Public-Private Secret with Charlotte Cotton in 2016, which is how I met Pauline, as one of my images was in that show. And as cultural director of Magnum, Pauline represented and promoted the work of Magnum photographers and spearheaded many major projects and exhibitions. Pauline's new Aperture book, edited with Lesley Martin, is an overdue look at the diverse output of Japanese women photographers since the birth of the medium. And now it's my privilege to turn it over to Dr. Vermare.
Thank you so much, Nancy. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you all and to be able to share my research with you. I'm actually going to share it now with you all. Nancy, can you see my my PowerPoint?
Yes, I can.
Oh, perfect. So as Nancy said, I've been working in photographic museums for now about 20 years. Last year, I stopped working to focus on independent projects, including my PhD that I just finished, that was about Northern Ireland, the visual representation of Northern Ireland from 1969 to today. And then in parallel with that research that was in fact a 20-year-long research on Ireland, I started another one, which is the one I'm going to tell you about today, on Japanese women photographers. This project came about during COVID, actually, in 2020, 2021, when a museum in Paris called La Maison Européenne de la Photographie invited me to work, to present the work of Japanese women photographers. And I told them, I'm not really a specialist. I did grow up in Japan. I was in Japan when I was a child, and then I studied Japanese in Paris when I came back. But I had never really felt, I don't know, there was something there with Japanese photography. I wasn't quite sure I should be there. And I never went there until that museum, who had read a few texts that I had written for this book that you see here, in Histoire mondiale des femmes photographes, a book I wrote little articles for. 130 of us historians of photography contributed to it. In fact, I wrote about Nancy Burson for that book, and also a few Japanese women photographers who I happen to like. And so the museum in Paris saw those articles and asked me if I would work on the subject. And I had 3 weeks to research, and the result of this research was so overwhelmingly beautiful and surprising that I thought that I should make a book of it. And so that's what I'm doing now with, in fact, with Textuel in France, but also Aperture here, and a Japanese publisher at the same time. It will come out in 2024. So this theme of female photographers is not new. In fact, this show here that was in Paris, organized in Paris by one of the two women who edited the volume I showed you before, Marie Robert and Luce Lebar, are who made that book, edited that book. And this show, Who is Afraid of Female Photographers, was organized in 2015 in Paris and 2016. And it was the most incredible. It was at the Musée d'Orsay and at the Musée de l'Orangerie. It was overwhelmingly beautiful and exciting, and it was a fun show. It was nothing. It was. I mean, it was incredibly deep and in research, but it was also a bit of a tongue-in-cheek kind of title, of course, Who's Afraid of Female Photographers. And it was the first big moment for female photographers, at least in France. I think France, as well as Japan, are a little behind in terms of recognition of the work of female artists. And so that was a big moment for French photography. Here recently, in fact, in 2021, Elizabeth Becker, published this really important book. If anyone is interested in the subject, You Don't Belong Here, which is about 3 women, 2 journalists and 1 photojournalist, Catherine Leroy, who you see up there in that photograph. That's her French war photographer, and about the fact that for so long, female, women were not really welcome to work on the field, certainly not in war photography being the most macho field, of course, of all. So that was a very important book that came out, and I recommend reading. This book, What They Saw, a historical photo book by women, by Rosette Lederman, edited by Rosette Lederman, is also very important. It's a compilation of all the photo books made by female photographers from the birth of the medium. And it, in fact, got the Aperture Book Award last year, 2021, at Paris Photo. And it's a goldmine for photo book lovers, and it's also a highly recommended read. So when I was asked by the Maison Européenne de la Photographie to focus on 3 female photographers, I thought maybe I should focus on 3 of them, Tsuneko Sasamoto, Toyoko Tokiwa, and Miyako Ishiuchi, who you see there, representing different moments. Tsuneko Sasamoto is the 30s, 40s, 50s. Toyoko Tokiwa was more the 50s. Miyako Ishiuchi is ongoing from the 70s to today. And so today I'm going to present their work to you as a little introduction, and then I'm going to go into the more contemporary work, which is stunning. And you'll see there's more and more, and it's absolutely breathtaking how beautiful and diverse it is. So I'm going to start with Tsuneko Sasamoto, who died just recently, this past summer. She was almost 108 years old, which is part of why she was so famous, but also because she lived so long that she was able to cover so much of the history of Japan. So this is her in the 30s. She was in her 20s, starting to become a photographer. She was influenced greatly by Margaret Bourke-White, but also by Man Ray, whose movies she had greatly admired. And so interestingly, she started working in the 30s, and in the 30s, Japan was, a very nationalistic, starting the imperialistic views on Asia, the colonization. So she was documenting that for Japan, but also the relationship with America. So this is right before 38. That's exchange students between Japan and America. So that's the last moment when America and Japan were still collaborating, because right after came the tripartite agreement between Italy, Germany, and Japan. And this is in fact in Japan the Hitler Youth coming to visit Japan. So she was the only female photographer at the time, and certainly the only one getting access to all these moments. This is also the celebrations of the tripartite pact in 1940 in Japan. And then the war happens. There's Pearl Harbor in 1941. The camps, this photo by Dorothea Lange that for a long time was censored. ICP did a show a few years ago with all those photographs. It was really very moving and important in terms of revisiting history and through photography. Then the American forces landed in Japan after the Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombing. And so Tsuneko Sasamoto continues to document. So this is MacArthur arriving in Japan and his wife. And then she starts photographing post-war Japan. It has changed tremendously. In fact, this is the imperial family on a bus, because the imperial family has lost the power that they had. And so there's all those shifts going around. This is a socialist politician, and she took a photograph right before he was assassinated, later that day, actually. Street photographs, really interesting work, and really important for the history, because again, if you look at the work of in Japanese photography, you have very seldom the look of a woman looking at this moment in history, which is pretty much the premise of this book and this project. Is it's not that this has not been documented, but what was the perspective of the woman on Japanese history. So this is the dome of Hiroshima a few years after the bombing. And so Tsuneko Sasamoto was saying there must be photos that only a woman can take with her woman's eyes. And indeed, this is what you see in all those photographs. Not all of them, some of them you'll see are very abstract and have nothing to do with woman as a subject. However, when the woman is the subject and the woman is the photographer, such as in this one, there is something to be said about the fact that it's interesting to know that a woman took this photograph. In this case, this Japanese woman looking at an American soldier in Tokyo after the war. And so what's also important to look at is that after the war, of course, the American presence changed dramatically the relationship between men and women. This is a bar for hostess, you know, Japanese women entertaining American soldiers. This is, in fact, an American soldier marrying a Japanese woman. And so all of these scenes witnessed by Tsuneko Sasamoto, this is an interesting moment when women, in fact, Japanese women, were invited into a striptease club to tell them, look, it's not that bad. This is what happens in those clubs. It's not that bad. Tsuneko Sasamoto was very interested in political movements. These are wives of men who were striking during the 60s. This is a demonstration against the renewal of the agreement between the US and Japan, the peace agreement. And a woman had died, a young woman had died during a protest. So she followed all those movements. And she also started focusing greatly on women artists, Japanese female artists, painters, writers, because in society, in Japanese society, it was really, really difficult to be a woman artist, meaning not a woman at home, but a woman doing something outside of domesticity. And these are all the books. It's funny because she was not famous here at all until very recently, and still today not well known at all. But these were all the books coming out about her because of her age. I mean, you can see here Tsuneko Sasamoto at 99 years old, 100 years old, 101. And she was this character. In fact, she had become a national treasure, which is an official title in Japan. And she was dubbed the Annie Leibovitz of Japan. So she was really popular in that sense. And only recently did she become a little more well-known here in America when the Metropolitan Museum in New York and the National Gallery in DC organized this show, the new one Behind the Camera, by Andrea Nelson, the curator. And in fact, this was her on the poster. It was on the Metropolitan, maybe you saw that photograph. It was a bit controversial because, of course, she documented Japanese imperialism. And so some voices said, well, why do you put the photograph of a woman who sort of contributed to imperialism? And so it was an interesting controversy in and of itself. So the second photographer that I focused on for that masterclass was Toyoko Tokiwa, who's a very interesting photographer from the after the war. Her brother gave her her first camera. All of these photographers were self-taught, didn't study photography. And so with her brother's camera, she started taking photos of women at work, women who were working, in this case, a nurse. Toyoko Tokiwa grew up during the war, and her father was almost killed by a bombing and the fire. So Tokyo was bombed, heavily bombed, like Dresden in Germany. And many, many people died, and many people were really burnt almost to death, and that was the case of her father. So with that in mind, I think is how she started taking photographs of history, but particularly of women. There was something for her that was really important about women in Japanese society. These are women wrestlers, women dancers. And here it's interesting to see what Japan is in the 40s and 50s. So there's that American presence. This was the big hit in 48, Tokyo Boogie Woogie. She's here, that's Toyoko Tokiwa speaking with American soldiers. And so there's the beginning of this relationship. It had started with the opening of the country you know, at the late 19th century. So it was not the first time that Americans came to Japan, but of course the circumstances were quite overwhelming with, you know, it was an occupation. And so Toyoko Tokiwa as a photographer had to document and wanted to document this from a female perspective. Here I'm showing you this very popular baby sun, this cartoon by Bill Hume, who was a GI, to show you also, you know, what the trauma could have been for Japanese women at the time is that there was this sexualization of the female body and the female in general. Here the caption says, "Can I help if you guys have a yen for me?" So there was the idea of prostitution that was becoming really overpowering. Prostitution had always been there in Japan. This was not a new thing, but the new thing was that the women being prostituted for the American soldiers. And so Toyoko Tokiwa grew up in Yokohama, which is where one of the military bases was. And as you will see, it will also be the center of another photographer's work. And so she took photographs of those GIs and soldiers with the female Japanese prostitutes in the outskirts of the base. This is a movie, Akasen Chitai, Red Light District, by Kenji Mizoguchi, that deals with, in 1956, a big social shift in Japan because prostitution was going to be banned for that reason also. And this is a movie that dealt with that, with prostitution in Japan. And what's interesting is that with that law, the 1956 law, it was not the consumer that was being sued or attacked. If there was, it was really the woman was going to be the guilty person, not the man. So it was a big moment for society in Japan. This was another movie by Yasujiro Ozu, Tokyo no Onna, a woman of Tokyo, that also, and that's way earlier, 1933, to show you that the subject was not new, and that dealt with the prostitution. This woman had to became a prostitute to pay for her brother's studies, actually. So that was the content, the theme around this book that became a masterpiece, Kiken na Adabana, Toxic, Dangerous, Fruitless Flower, which was about this situation. And here on the cover you see Toyoko Tokiwa, that's her behind her camera, and in the lens one of her photographs of a woman being taken away, a prostitute being taken away. This was really a revolution in terms of narration and narrative, self-person. So she wrote the text, she took the photographs. And at the time in the 50s, there were very few female Japanese photographers. So she was really, it was very empowering for herself, but also for the generation that followed. You know, this was an example of a really strong body of work, historical, but also artistic, by a Japanese female photographer. Here you can see that she's seen. And what's interesting is that at first Toyoko Tokiwa was a little shy, and so she would hide her camera in a furoshiki, which is a large piece of fabric, and she would hide the camera. And then more and more, she got to be known by the prostitutes, by the women in the neighborhood, she befriended them. And then at the end, she was openly taking photographs. And this, I think, is a very strong one because she's being seen or being looked at. So this book can be considered one of the earliest examples of strong, important photo book by a Japanese woman photographer. So Toyoko Tokiwa said, "What matters most to me is to look at this type of social evil as unacceptable as it is with my own eyes, and to show this reality as it is through art." So there's this idea of the sublimation that will come by, which is the essence of photography, of course, to transform the real and to make it something artistic or even imaginary. But this is what her purpose was. She also worked on the social reconversions of the prostitutes. Once the law was passed in 56, these women had to find another way to make a living. And so here she was looking at the life after that law passed. And this was the one that's used in the big book I showed you. This was a party celebrating the friendship between Japan and America. So there's a sadness. I mean, there's something also about a social malaise that she shows in those photographs. So the third photographer, Miyako Ishiuchi, is still alive. She was born in 1947. She's the one famous Japanese photographer, also because she had a show at the Getty Museum in 2015, organized by Amanda Maddox, and that made her more famous. She was at the Venice Biennale a few years before that. So she's probably the one, if you knew any Japanese female photographers, that would be her. And so here you see her printing. And the reason I chose to open with this photograph is because the prints are not that important in Japanese photography in general. Books are much more important. Prints need some space that there isn't so much of. But Miyako Ishiuchi really always was passionate about the prints, the printmaking. So that's her printing her own work. And it's interesting because she came from weaving. She was studying weaving and textile, and there's a link between the physicality of that and the physicality of the printing of the paper and of that science and that act of having the image, the pattern reveal itself through chemicals. And so that's always been a passion of hers. So she started influenced by this is the work by the first Japanese woman photographer, Ryu Shima. It's actually a portrait of her own husband, Kako Kushima. And she and Miyako Ishiuchi were from the same place in Japan, Gunma-ken, which is not too far from Tokyo. And so Miyako Ishiuchi was influenced or certainly inspired by the knowledge of that woman to become a photographer herself. In 1976, she created a collective. It was a short-lived collective of 10 Japanese women photographers called Rebellion of the Flowers, Hyakaryoran. And it was a show that really was more of a gesture to show that, yes, there were female photographers in this very masculine universe of photography. And that's how, in fact, that's a moment when Miyako Ishiuchi really decided to focus on the place she grew up, which is Yokosuka. And Yokosuka was another base, military base for the US troops. And that really certainly shaped her youth. And she wanted to document this is where the military bases are, and to show how still pretty much present they are today. So other photographers, male photographer and famous one, Shomei Tomatsu and Daido Moriyama, had taken photographs of Yokosuka before, that village, that town that she grew up in. But she said that she wanted to show it as she saw it, right? As a woman. I started photographing Yokosuka because I felt I was the only one who could reveal the city's true face. Of course, I was aware of the series made by Daido Moriyama and Shomei Tomatsu. However, they took pictures of the American quarter, which would make sense to them in the context of the protest against the Vietnam War. Daido Moriyama and Shomei Tomatsu pictured Yokosuka through the eyes of men, whereas I, as a woman, was not allowed access to the American base. They photographed America, whereas I depicted the story of my childhood. My approach was more intimate. I mapped out all of the neighborhoods surrounding the military base and made 3 series in total. So that's really the work of her. That's the pins, and that's Yokosuka as pinned by her. And these are the photographs. This could be seen as a self-portrait. She arrived at that age about when in Yokosuka, when her mom moved there. In fact, her mom was working on the military base as a truck driver. And these are the photographs that she took there. And that became really some of the most famous of her photographs. This is a hostess, a prostitute. The sign in the back says hostess. And so she was really also, like Toyoko Tokiwa, really interested in the interactions between those women, and in general, the relationship between Japan and America. That was a very complicated, very complex relationship, including the styles, right? The fashion was a very influenced, like in this photograph. And she made a series of books. This one was the famous one, the most famous, the 79, Yokosuka story. And then she kept going back and making more books and other books. And she was supported, and that's something to also note, that many of these photographers, male photographers, supported the female photographers. In this case, Shomei Tomatsu wrote the foreword to this book, and others. So here she was looking for small apartments, the size of the one she grew up in, which was a very small very small space, and she took photos of people living in those very, very small apartments. And she was very interested in the traces, and this is something that I find really beautiful in her work, the traces of the past. And this, you know, in this photograph, you can see, I mean, the traces of the humidity and of erosion, and of course, knowing that the war was not so far behind, you know, traces of the past in that sense too, which looks like Kikoji Kawada's Chizu, the map, a re-edition. There was a new edition of that book last year came out, and it was all about the traces of this, in this case, of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. And he had photographed the photos in the dome, in fact, of what he thought were the souls of the people who had evaporated at that very moment of the impact. And I think that between this and that, I mean, there's certainly something to be said about the traces of the past in that sort of the traumatic way. So I'm showing you here, I mean, there was a big series of work that she did. This was a former brothel for the army that she took photos of. And so that was, for the longest time, really the center of her attention. Yokosuka again in 1990. And then a little later in her life, she started being interested in sorry, I'm going a little fast on the books because I don't want to overwhelm with you all the books, but you can see that she really kept going back and publishing in all ways the remainders of the past. And so when she turned 40 in 1987, she started thinking about a completely different subject than the war and than the remains of the war. She started thinking about the female body and her own body that was turning 40, and how traumatic it was for women that a young body alone was interesting. So that in commercials and movies and stuff, it was always about the young body, the younger body, and that past 40, a woman was kind of expired in a sense. And so she started taking photographs of women her age, of their hands, of their skin. And there was something, so this was really the first project where she thinks about gender more deeply. She had already questioned the question of, you know, is it a man taking the photograph or is it a woman? But here there's something about the body of the woman and the aging, and that leads her to focus on her mother. And this is the project that made her famous, Mothers, in 2002. She started it when her mom was still alive, and she had a complicated relationship with her mother. And as she was doing the project, her mom passed away, and she took photos of belongings, things that had belonged to her mother. As you can see here, lipsticks and clothes, shoes. And this became really the project that traveled. So this was presented by Michiko Kasahara, a curator who was really promoting the work of female Japanese photographers at the Biennale of Venice in 2005. And then there was a big show at the Getty. And so this is really the work that made her the most famous. And then she went on to, she kept on focusing on that, on scars, on skins, on the remains of the past. And there's one project she was invited by the Museum of the War in Hiroshima, and she took photos of clothing. And that's a moment, that's her saying this, the things in front of us contain the passage of time. And that's exactly what she's interested in. Miyako Ishiuchi is really interested in the past and bringing the past into the present to really take it into consideration. And you can see those clothes are clothes of girls or women, they're stained. And then later she was invited by the Frida Kahlo Museum in Mexico to do the same thing with Frida Kahlo's belongings. And so it became the series that is also quite well known. There's a movie, I'll send you a link. I'll send a few links to Nancy to share with you all if you're interested, but this is a beautiful documentary film made about her where she says, I just thought that photos would make history. I wanted to be someone who makes history. And there's that obsession, like many photographers have. Gilles Perez is another one who's obsessed with making history. But I think that's really something to be said about those three photographers is that they really were in history and wanted to be there for history. And so I looked at all their work, and suddenly I discovered all these other photographers. And I thought, this is incredible, the amount of incredibly talented Japanese female photographers that we do not know about. And so here I'm going to show you in no special order the work of historical and then contemporary. So it kind of is chronological. And so you can see the moments and how things shift. Eiko Yamazawa was a great artist on working on abstraction. And for me, looking into all this work so this, for instance, was more about politics and the occupation and Okinawa, of course, which is a subject that comes back a lot in the work of these women photographers, but also sometimes, more social, political subjects from within society, the Japanese society, the students' uprisings in 68 that were the same, in fact, in France, for instance, with Mai 68. So Hitomi Watanabe was very famous for documenting that moment in time. That's her book, Shinjuku, 1968. That was republished. Many of these books, interestingly enough, were published and republished later on. So the book is really important. This is really the medium of choice for Japanese photography. And that's how these photographers could share their work, really, amongst themselves. Kunie Sugiura has been living in the US. She's in New York. She's been in New York for a long time. And she moved to the US in the 60s. Her mother and grandmother urged her to move, and she went to study at the Art Institute of Chicago, and she never went back. Tamiko Nishimura is also an incredibly talented photographer, very little known, collaborated with Daido Moriyama at some point. In fact, in one of his books, you have a few of her photographs in. So it's interesting. You see, the relationship with the US is always a bit of a fascination. For some of them, Riko Yoshida was really interested and came here to see Harlem. She really wanted to photograph Harlem. Michiko Matsumoto was interested in women. So that's one case of, and that's the problem with discussing this project. A project like this, you don't want to be essentialist, right? You don't want to talk about only women photographers who focused on women, because not all of them did, but some of them did. Like Michiko Matsumoto was really interested in the women's liberation and all in feminism. And feminism is a word that itself does not really translate well in Japan. It doesn't mean much. But only in a few cases do you see real American feminism in Japan, and that is one. I love the work of Sato Minihongi. She was really interested in punk rock and life in the margins. So that's one of her books in 1979. And another one, work made in the 1970s about transgender Tokyo people, and the book was published very recently, and it's really beautiful, and it's a wonderful body of work. Hana Takeda was really interested in animals. It's an interesting thing also. There's something that's recurring, the animal kingdom in Japanese photography. Another book that's about Okinawa, and you'll see that there are a few of them. This is another project on Okinawa. In fact, Mao Ishikawa is also someone you might have heard of. A book was published recently by Miwa Susuda of Dashwood Books. It's a wonderful bookstore. I recommend highly. And so she is from Okinawa, Mao Ishikawa, and she befriended soldiers, and this is all about those years in the 80s where she was hanging out with Japanese women who were hanging out with American soldiers, and just their daily life there. She then went to Philadelphia to follow one of the soldiers, the GIs that she had met there. And that's the book I'm talking about that was recently republished by Session Press. Funny ones like this one. I know it's a little bit eccentric, by Mutsuko Yoshida. And really very poetic ones as well. Tokuko Ushioda just had a show here in New York, and this was a major discovery. I like to say that in French, we have this saying, and I'm sure it's in English too, champ contre champ, so shot, reverse shot. And what I think is interesting in a work like this one is that you have the vision, the perspective of the woman, the mother, the wife, and in fact, her husband, whose book it is about, on the left, is also a photographer, a famous photographer. And the fact that we can now see the work that she did all these years, a beautiful work, is just super important, I think, in terms of filling the gap. I think there were big blind spots in the history of photography where we didn't really look at. It was not deliberate, but we would not see the woman's perspective. And in a case like this one, I think it's an example of what we had missed. Another beautiful body of work. Fashion photography, Yuriko Takagi. She's going to have a show in Kyoto in the spring, and she was one of the famous Japanese fashion photographers. Mariko Mori is a very funny, she's very eccentric, and she was very much into the performance, including performing as a quote-unquote geisha, because there's a whole mythology of the geisha, which many of the photographers play with. A geisha was not at all a prostitute. In fact, was not at all. She was a woman who a man could have a conversation with, which is the irony is that in fact it was not sexual, it was more intellectual. So they were highly educated women who would spend time with married men. And so Mariko Mori plays with this idea that, the modern time geisha, and she's represented, I think, by Sean Kelly. She's really more contemporary art than photography, but she uses photography to do a lot of performance as well. That's a book that came out in '94. It was also the result of an ongoing collaboration between Araki, Nobuyoshi Araki, and Nan Goldin in the '90s that kind of had an influence in the work that I'm going to show you now, which is a work that is empowered, and that is about women taking control of their image. It's about agency. And because in those years, right then, started this movement in Japan of younger photographers, teen to 25, say, who used instant cameras, snapshots to document their own lives, sexual life, but also just daily life, as you can see in this work. And Yuri Nagashima became really one of the most famous examples of that moment that was dubbed girly photography at the time, although that expression has since been really deconstructed and say, well, that was a little infantilizing. It was a little derogative, wasn't it? Because it was not girls. I mean, these were really, there was something diminishing the work somehow in that expression itself. And so it has become, Yuri Nagashima, she's one of the few Japanese photographers who considers herself a feminist, and she really has been writing books about this. I'm going to show you that book. So that's Hero Mix is another one from that period. And there was a playfulness and a melancholy. I mean, it was a moment in the 90s. It was a crisis in Japan. The real estate bubble had exploded, and there was this melancholy for sure in that work. So all these women were really, they were really working with the camera almost in a filmic way. I mean, I think that Ai Nakano, this work reminds me a lot of Wong Kar-wai and Chungking Express, and it was all those years, same years. And during this time, you still had sort of more classic black and white work done by other photographers. This is very surrealist by Michiko Kon. And then Rinko Kawauchi came along. So that's the early 2000s. And this was another kind of revolution in Japanese female photography and in Japanese photography really at large, because it was absolutely subconscious. I mean, there was something incredibly spiritual about this work. And still today, she's having a big show in Tokyo at the moment. There was something, I would like, is it magical? Is it something like this? But something beautifully spontaneous about this work. And it was not about the self. This was really about the universe, almost about something bigger than us. And it became a big moment in Japanese female photography. And she influenced many photographers after her. Yuki Onodera, she lives in Paris. Here she put a marble in her camera, which I thought was very funny and playful. And I love it because it looks like the new wave. It looks like the 70s in England. And in fact, what you can see here is an orb created by a marble in her camera. Tomoko Sawada worked a lot on identity. So many of them really worked on identity, but also on the environment. Lieko Shiga here worked a lot. She was in the north of Japan, and especially after the tsunami of 2011. And you'll see that more and more of this work after 2011, after the trauma of the tsunami, a lot of the work becomes about the environment and about nature and how we need to preserve it. Kunye Sugiura, who we've seen before, so she's the one she's based in New York, and she had a whole series of portraits of artists. On the right here is, and of course I'm blanking on her name, all the polka dots, it's going to come back to me, and she was the photo I think that Nancy used.
Kusama.
Merci, Yayoi Kusama, exactly. And she took Jasper Jones. I mean, she has a whole series of artists that's really a wonderful series. I love that series by Asako Narahashi. So she would go in the water to take her photographs. So nature, I think, is another big theme in the work. And also, of course, mise en scène. Mika Nagawa is really the queen of the mise en scène and of the staging of herself in all sorts of various settings. Here, a bit of a tongue-in-cheek with Disney. Rika Noguchi and Rinko Kawauchi are the same period of time and they have the same look, this sort of very poetic and atmospheric kind of body of work. And it's also interesting to see that some of the photographers focused on men. A lot of the work that we could see from Japan was on women, naked women and bondage. A lot of it was that we could see Araki's work. And to look at the work of female photographers, suddenly you have a completely other vision of Japanese society in Japan. It's about family, it's about life from the female perspective, which I think was missing. And only when you see the two can you really have a good idea of representation of what Japan is or can be and what it was all these years. Miki Kohara is also a wonderful photographer of the daily life. And you can see it's not direct, it's not this sort of contrasted black and white and violent vision of Japan. It's this very tender view, which complements what we know. And again, that's certainly the feeling that got me when I was preparing that masterclass at the time is, oh my goodness, this is the Japan I knew when I was a child. This is what I saw. I did not recognize, I loved Daido Moriyama, but for me, it was another Japan. It was very masculine. It was very viril. This for me is what I experienced in Japan growing up. Tokyo Rumando was a sex, she worked in a sex club and she's a performer. And so now she's using photography in a playful way that I love. And she's another one who says, I'm not a feminist, I'm just a woman with a camera. And there's something there where she's playing with it, but it's not a statement, it's not activism, it's really just a playfulness and a deliberate desire to show yourself. And I'm almost
great.
And so then I would love any questions you have.
Great, thank you.
This is a student that I met at ICP when I was working at ICP at the time, and she never published a book. And that's always the problem. That can be a little frustrating, is that I would love to see it gathered, because I thought that project was so beautiful. She was creating memories. So she had never been to Coney Island with her mother, but this was her in the arms of her mother in juxtaposition with Coney Island. And I thought this was really beautiful work. And there's a lot of that, a lot of beautiful poetry. And again, a lot of self-representation, intimacy, men through the eyes of women, which is always good to see after having seen so many photos of women through the eyes of men. And in fact, Sakiko Nomura is quite well known for that body of work angle. Mayumi Hosokura is also very interested in genders and the question of the body. This is a body of work that I encourage you to go see. This is a reaction to the tsunami. Mayumi Suzuki, was from a family of photographers. They had a lab in the north, and then both parents died during the earthquake and tsunami, and she made a book about this project, about the recovered photos from her father's archive. Identity, as you can see, is really important in all these bodies of work. Self-representation again. And this is a body of work that's really well known in France and not at all here. And I suspect it's because the French photo world is more interested maybe in sort of poetic bodies of work, artistic, sort of painterly. And she won many awards for this book and others. Beautiful project about Alzheimer, about this photographer's grandmother who had Alzheimer. That's also about the tsunami. This is a work by Mari Katayama, who lost the use of her legs, and all her work is about this, about her body and about sort of connecting with the world despite the handicap. And she's been recognized as one of the greatest photographers of this generation. Momo Okabe is also very well known. She works on questions of gender and transgender and sex change operations. These are all her friends and herself. She's been documenting over the past years, life in the margins. This book is called Il Matar, was very important when it came out. These are photographs taken in Saul Leiter Studio by Yumiko Izu, beautiful body of work. The Animal World, as I was telling you about, beautiful book called Shikawatari, Deer Crossing. And yeah, nature in general, spirituality, there's a lot of that, I feel like, in all this work, traditions, ancestral traditions, spiritual connections. This is actually a project made in Iceland with twins, little twin girls that Ariko Inaoka had met on a trip, and she went back every year. Hiroko Komatsu is doing incredible books like this one. This is a book in a bottle. So there's a lot of playing with the books and with the language as well. This was all about ecology, in fact, about the environment. Yuri Nagashima, who we saw earlier, she's really been all these years working a lot on the idea of self. This is what she was saying about that book. My motive for writing this was first and foremost desire to come to terms with the painful memories of myself and fellow photographers back when we were young. And this is what I was telling you about earlier, when they were called girly photographs. At the time, they were young and they couldn't quite figure out what was wrong about being called girly photographers. And then as she grew up, a little bit like Miyako Ishiuchi, starting to question the whole idea of women in Japanese society and age, she started to become really very vocal about that, about how do you talk about us? Let us talk about ourselves. Yeah, and that's the end of the presentation. I'll welcome any questions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for taking us through that. That's amazing history. I actually had a couple of questions. I'm going to remind everybody to please throw some questions into the Q&A so we can really get a conversation going here. One of the things you said that I thought was really fascinating, and I'd love to ask you to talk a little bit more about it. At one point you said that, and forgive me, I don't remember, I didn't know who you were specifically talking about. There were so many names that were going on. Yeah. But you said that it was sort of making history versus being in history. And I thought that was a really interesting distinction between one or the other. Can you just sort of go in a little more in depth into what that really sort of looks like? What is the difference for you there?
That's interesting. I think so. I was talking about Miyako Ishiuchi, who worked on a period of time that was not there anymore, right? I mean, Hiroshima, the Second World War was not her story. She was born in 1947, and yet she was really interested in that history that had preceded her. And through photography, she was able to not be in history, not in that history, because she couldn't be anymore, but to make it come back and to let it be discussed. And I think what really mattered to her when she was working on Yokosuka's story and then all the projects, including Hiroshima, excuse me, was that she was able, through photography, to gather traces of history. So it was not so much as Tsuneko Sasamoto of being in history, documenting history as it unfolds, but through traces of history to build her own history of Japan through what she could feel of it. So it's not so much as a historian, really. It's not even so much as a documentarian, because she's not documenting history either, but she's documenting traces of history. And in doing so, she is telling history. So she's retelling history.
That's really interesting, because then that also, I mean, we can't let go of the fact that that's somewhat subjective as well, right? So there's certainly can be a personal narrative that's going on in that as you are making that history, right? I mean, that's kind of fascinating.
Absolutely. Yeah. She deliberately does this in a subjective manner. But if you look at the work of other great, he's like, look at the work of Gilles Perez. I was just mentioning him because that's also his obsession. It was very subjective too. So that's always the big question. Can you be objective? But certainly for her, it was deliberately subjective. It was deliberately a point of view, her own point of view as a female photographer, as a woman who grew up in Yokosuka.
Right. And I think you just brought up another great point. I think that we could have hours worth of conversation about is the objectivity versus subjectivity of photography as a medium on the whole, right? I mean, because even somebody who is actually documenting history as it's happening, it's still a subjective viewpoint, right?
Absolutely. Including documentary movie makers, how can you be completely objective? Because you come with your own background and all of those things. Yeah.
Well, even in your choice of camera angle, for example, and something as simple as that's a totally subjective decision to make. Fascinating. Okay. So another thing that I was thinking about, so you've taken us through, 70 years worth of work or so, right? And it seemed to me that the book still seems to hold a huge significance for Japanese photographers, as opposed to, say, American, where for a very long time, the print was really the main, sort of end to photography. What drove that, do you think? Like, how did that sort of move in the direction of bookmaking and, prints in that format versus prints on the wall?
So there are a few factors. One is that the book was easily shareable and easily stockable in small places. And it sounds very pragmatic, but this was a big thing, is that Japanese apartments are very small. There's no real place for storage. The prints, the climate is very humid and hot in the summers and very cold and dry in the winters, meaning that your prints are going to crumple and are going to break the emulsion. So all of these practical details are to be taken into consideration. But there's also something to be said about, I think, the art of etching, woodblocks and all of that. I mean, there's always been the idea, all of them, the woodblocks were in little albums, they were shared in little albums, hand-sewn. And I think there's something like this that came through generation and through centuries. The idea of the album remained, and to have a photographic album. In fact, many of them, I should have some here, but are still hand-sewn little photo books. But I think most importantly, it is the shareability of the photo book and how many images you can fit in one little book, how many images, and there's a huge amount of photo books in Japan, for sure. It might be the world top, compared to France and America, certainly the place in the world that produces the greatest number of photo books, and especially Japanese women photographers. There's a huge amount of books produced over the past, I would say, since the 1990s.
Wow, amazing. That's great. And you had mentioned Dashwood Books earlier. I love that store as well, and I think it suggests that everybody that's tuning in from New York should spend the whole afternoon, if not an entire day, in that store. There's so much to look at. It's a tiny space, but amazing books that are there. So we have a question from Dane, one of our students now. He's saying, I'd like to know what kind of challenges, if you know firsthand, the artists face during the transgender documentation piece, especially from a cultural point of view, comparing American culture to the Japanese cultures.
Yeah, so I think MoMA Okabe, and I'll share things with you through Nancy at some point, but she spoke about this, that photographer, how hard it is in Japan today. So it's interesting because there is a big transgender, or certainly cross-gender culture, including in theater in Japan, where many female characters were played by men, in kabuki and all of that. So it's not like there's as compared to the French are really bad with anything that's not male or female. There's this thing. In Japan, it's a little more complex, and I would say it's a little more open. However, MoMA Okabe was witnessing this circle. The problem in Japanese society is more that there should be a homogeneity. There's something about the collective that is much more important than the individual compared to French or American societies, and that the struggle is more on that level. It's not so much the sexual or the gender question. It is the fact that you're going to then not fit in the overall framework of society. And this is what MoMA Okabe was talking about in Ilmatar, and still today talking about how do you do in Japan to fit when there's nothing that allows you to fit, when you're not completely quote unquote normal, when you're in. This also goes, it's true, starts with women who are not domestic, mothers and wives and mothers do not fit. So imagine if you're not fitting in your own category of gender.
Interesting. That's kind of fascinating. I'd love to at some point see more of that book and see where that's kind of gone.
Yeah, so. You should ask, because Dashwood's wonderful Miwa Susudashi published another book by MoMA Okabe called Dildo, and that was very important also. That was all about those friends, the circle of friends, and the gender, the non-binary, the sex change operations and all of that.
Interesting. Great. So again, I'm going to ask you guys, attendees, to please send in some more questions. We have another couple of minutes, so please let's pick Pauline's brain a little bit further on this subject. So send in some more questions, please.
In fact, I have a question for you all. Is that we're still looking for a title. I've been trying to think of a title for this book, because of course we don't want to call it Japanese women photographers, because it's too categorical and it's this big lump, and we want to. So if you have any ideas or thoughts on, so I've been really reading a lot of Japanese women poets and writers to maybe find, but if you have any inspiration, any suggestion, I will take them. Not even, if it's later in time, I'll welcome any suggestion.
Great. All right. Well, we'll run a contest among our students to come up with some names for you. That's cool.
And I also wanted to say, because I know this is more of a film, it's a film school, but there was a beautiful cycle at the Japan Society that ended last month on Japanese movie directors. I'll send the link again, but it was interesting because it's even fewer of them in the cinema world, fewer Japanese female directors, and it was a beautiful cycle. And I think I'm sure you can still view the films online.
And
so, sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
I was going to say, as I recall, Lesley Martin spent a few years in Japan as well, correct?
She did. She studied there, and that's why she wanted to do a book about Japanese women photographers as well, because she was really, in fact, she was particularly interested in the 90s, that period when, as I mentioned, the girly photographs and all of that moment. She wanted to do a book about that, and in the end, it became this bigger book about Japanese women photographers at large.
Great. All right. Well, we don't have more questions coming in, so I think I'm just going to give you a huge thank you for your time and sharing your knowledge and the sort of the growth of this project. I mean, it's really, really fascinating. I personally learned a ton about it. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
We learned so much from you this morning. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation very much, and I wish you all happy holidays.
Great. Thanks. Same to you.
Thank you.
And thank you everyone for being here. We've got a whole bunch of great people other than our students that have joined in. So thank you guys all for being here.
Thanks
again, Pauline.
Bye.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.